Welcome to the Deep Dive. We sort through the noise to bring you the core insights on, well, really fascinating topics.
And today we're jumping into a big one. What happens after we die?
Right. We're using Leslie Kean's book, Surviving Death. A journalist investigates evidence for an afterlife, based on the sources you sent over.
Yeah, it's quite the exploration. And Kean, she's got serious credentials. New York Times bestseller, known for investigating tough subjects like UAPs, unexplained aerial phenomena.
So she brings that journalistic mindset to this.
Definitely. An investigative approach.
And the book's goal is pretty clear.
Mm-hmm.
Look at actual, empirical evidence that suggests consciousness, you might carry on after the body stops.
Mm-hmm. Not just philosophy or belief, she's after data.
And the data she looks at is really varied.
Oh yeah, she covers a lot of ground. Spontaneous past life memories, near-death experiences, out-of-body stuff,
Mediums.
communications, yeah. And even some really strange physical events. It ties together areas that are often looked at separately.
What's also interesting is Kean herself, she mixes the journalistic digging with her own personal experiences with some of this stuff.
Right, which adds another layer. She's not just reporting from the outside, she's also sharing what she encountered firsthand.
It's like, here's the research, and here's what happened to me. It definitely shapes the narrative.
It does. It sort of raises that question about balancing objectivity and personal experience, especially with topics like these.
For sure. So, just to give everyone a roadmap for this deep dive, the book's broken down into 4 main parts.
Okay.
First, is there life before birth? That's the reincarnation stuff.
Got it.
Then to death and back again, NDEs and OBEs.
Near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences. Yeah.
Third is communications from non-local minds, mental mediumship.
Okay, communicating with...
Well, the departed.
And the last part is the impossible made real, physical phenomena.
Ah, the really controversial stuff.
Pretty much. And a key thing to grasp, like you mentioned, is her focus. It's about personal survival. Right, not just merging into some cosmic goo, but the idea that your individual identity, your you-ness, continues.
Exactly. So our mission today, pull out the main themes, the key evidence cases, research, experts, and understand Kean's arguments for postmortem survival. Give you a solid handle on the book.
Sounds good.
And where do we start?
Let's dive into part 1. Is there life before birth? The reincarnation evidence.
Okay, so this part is all about kids, young kids, who seem to just spontaneously remember past lives.
Yeah, and Kean emphasizes cases from Western cultures.
Right, where reincarnation isn't, a common belief, which is important.
Why is that so important?
Well, it makes it harder to just say, oh, they absorbed it from the culture, or, their parents suggested it.
Gotcha. And the book opens with a really powerful case, James Leininger, Chapter 1, Airplane Crash on Fire.
Oh, yeah, that story is something else. You've got this toddler, not even 2,
barely talking,
having these incredibly vivid recurring nightmares.
Airplane crash on fire, little man can't get out. Just awful. Absolutely terrifying for his parents. But it wasn't just nightmares, was it?
No. As he got a bit older, he started showing this weirdly specific knowledge
about WWII planes.
Yeah, like identifying them, correcting his parents on details.
And then he starts claiming he was a pilot. James
flew a Corsair, he said, off the USS Natoma Bay.
And that he was shot down by the Japanese at Iwo Jima.
I mean, imagine hearing that from your 3-year-old.
Especially, as Kean points out, because the parents were Christian, reincarnation was not on their radar at all.
They were skeptical.
Very, and quite distressed by it all. But the kid was so persistent
that the dad, Bruce, eventually started looking into it.
Right. He started investigating, reluctantly maybe.
Probably. But what he found, well, that's the core of it.
He found things that matched.
Unbelievably so.
Yeah.
He verified the ship, the USS Natoma Bay, was at Iwo Jima.
Okay.
He found records of a pilot named James M. Houston Jr.
No way.
Killed at Iwo Jima, flying from that exact carrier.
Ugh.
And even other details James mentioned, like names of squadron mates, they checked out too.
So what does a case like that suggest? I mean, how do you explain it conventionally?
That's the challenge, right? Fantasy. Seems too specific, too accurate. Suggestion. Yeah. The parents were actively against the idea initially.
Yeah, it really pushes against simple explanations. It kind of forces you to consider, well, other possibilities.
Exactly. And Kean shows this isn't just a one-off. There are patterns researchers see across many of these childhood cases.
Right. There are common threads, like the age they start talking about it.
Usually really young, yeah. Between 2 and 4.
Yeah, average around 35 months, apparently. And they often focus on how the previous life ended.
Especially if it was an unnatural death. Something like 70% recall that.
Which is a high number. And the lives they remember aren't usually ancient history.
No, often quite recent. The gap between lives can be short, just a few years on average.
Median is like 17 months, I think she says. And they're usually remembering being ordinary people, often living nearby, not, Cleopatra or Napoleon.
Right, not famous figures. And there are behaviors associated, too.
Sometimes kids show this intense longing for their other family, or they might have skills or knowledge that seem out of place.
And phobias.
Yeah, that's a big one. Especially in the unnatural death cases, maybe 35% have phobias that seem directly linked to how they say they died, like fear of water if they drowned.
That's specific. And then there's the really strange stuff. Physical links.
Birthmarks or defects that supposedly match wounds from the previous life. It's another layer of unusual correlation.
And then the memories just fade.
Often, yeah. Around age 6 or 7, as they get more grounded in their current life, the past life memories tend to disappear.
It's like a window that opens and closes.
Kind of. And again, the fact these cases pop up globally, including the U.S., like Leininger.
Undercuts the it's just cultural belief argument.
Exactly. The parents' initial resistance, their distress, that's key evidence against simple suggestion.
Okay, so that's the reincarnation angle. Let's move to part 2. To death and back again. NDEs and OBEs.
Right. Near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences. These are the things people report when they've been, clinically dead or right on the edge.
What are the common features Kean talks about?
Well, a big one is that sense of being out of your body.
Like floating above, looking down.
Exactly.
Wow.
Perceiving yourself and the room, the doctors, whatever, from an external viewpoint, which right there challenges the idea that consciousness is stuck inside the skull.
And then there are the more transcendental bits.
The tunnel, the light.
A feeling of incredible peace.
Love.
Yeah, overwhelming peace, unconditional love. Sometimes meeting deceased relatives or beings of light.
The life review comes up a lot, too.
Right, seeing your life flash before your eyes, but often with this sense of understanding the impact of your actions.
And finally, often there's a point where they feel they have to decide or are told to go back.
A conscious choice to return, yeah.
Kean notes how consistent these core elements are, right, across different cultures. Yeah, that's a key point. If it was just hallucination based on belief, you'd expect much more variation. The consistencies suggest something. Well, something more fundamental might be happening.
And the most compelling evidence here, arguably, is the veridical perception cases.
Ah, yes. This is crucial. Veridical means truthful, accurate.
So these are cases where the person, while supposedly unconscious or even clinically dead,
accurately perceives things in the physical world that they couldn't possibly know through their normal senses at that time.
things happening in the operating room, or maybe even down the hall.
Exactly. Details they couldn't see or hear normally, especially if their eyes are taped shut, they're under deep anesthesia, or their heart has stopped.
Like the Pam Reynolds case.
That's probably the most famous example, yeah. Complex brain surgery, body cooled way down, no measurable brain activity for a time.
Flat EE, stopped heart.
Right. And yet, she later describes specific surgical instruments, conversations, things that happened during that period of supposed oblivion.
That's hard to square with the brain just switching off.
It is, and Kean brings in experts, like Dr. Pim van Lommel, a Dutch cardiologist.
He studied cardiac arrest survivors, didn't he? Prospectively.
Yeah, large-scale studies. And his conclusion was basically that science, as it stands, can't really explain how these complex, clear experiences happen when the brain is apparently offline.
He called for more open-minded research.
He did. He argues the data just doesn't fit the standard materialist model neatly.
So how does this NDEOB evidence, especially the veridical stuff, challenge that standard model?
Well, the standard model, strict materialism, basically says consciousness is brain activity. Full stop. No brain activity, no consciousness.
Simple enough.
But if people are having clear, structured experiences and sometimes even perceiving verifiable external events while brain activity is severely compromised or absent,
Then consciousness isn't just brain activity.
that's the implication. It suggests consciousness might be able to function at least temporarily independently of the physical brain. Maybe the brain is more like a receiver or an interface, not the generator.
Which opens up huge questions about what consciousness actually is. Exactly. Where does it come from? Can it persist?
Which leads us neatly into part 3, communications from non-local minds, mental mediumship.
Right. So can consciousness, if it survives, actually communicate back. This section looks at mediums people who claim they can connect with discarnate personalities.
Kean makes a distinction here, right, between mediumship and just general psychic stuff. Psi-psi.
Yeah, it's an important point. General psi might be telepathy with the living or clairvoyance about objects or events. Mediumship specifically claims contact with deceased individuals. The source of the information is supposedly different.
And she looks at scientific attempts to investigate this.
She highlights Dr. Julie Beischel's work at the Windbridge Research Center. They use really rigorous methods.
Like the quadruple blind protocols. What does that mean practically?
It means layers of blinding to prevent information leakage. The medium doesn't know who the reading is for or anything about the deceased person.
The person getting the reading, the sitter, doesn't interact directly with the medium during the reading itself.
Right.
The researchers handling the communication don't know which deceased person corresponds to which reading.
Wow.
And even the people scoring the accuracy of the information later don't know which reading came from which medium or belonged to which sitter until it's all done.
So it strips away all the usual ways information could accidentally get through.
Yeah.
No visual cues, no leading questions, no prior knowledge.
Exactly. It's designed to isolate whether the medium is getting genuinely anomalous information stuff they shouldn't know that is specific and accurate about the deceased.
Trying to rule out fraud, cold reading,
Yeah.
grief-stricken suggestion, all that.
Pretty much. And Beischel also looks at the psychological side, the potential therapeutic aspect for the bereaved.
Kean includes specific examples, right? Case studies.
Yeah, she presents accounts where mediums provided very specific details, names, obscure memories, personality quirks that were apparently verified by the sitters.
And Kean herself had readings.
She did, and she describes them as amazing, life-changing. She felt she connected with her deceased brother and a friend.
What made her feel that? Was it just the information?
She mentions the accuracy of private details, yes, but also something more qualitative. A sense of their actual personality coming through, the feeling of them being present.
That subjective feeling of presence. But even if the information is accurate under blind conditions, there's still a debate, isn't there?
Oh, yeah. The big one. Survival versus super psi.
Okay, break that down.
So let's say a medium, under perfect blinding, gives incredibly accurate info about Uncle Bob. Option 1, survival. The medium is actually communicating with Uncle Bob's surviving consciousness.
Makes sense. Option 2.
Option 2, super psi. The medium isn't talking to Bob, but is using some extraordinary psychic ability, super ESP, to get the info from other sources.
Like reading the sitter's mind, even subconscious memories.
Exactly. Or maybe psychically accessing documents somewhere, or tapping into the minds of other living people who knew Bob, or maybe even some kind of universal information field, like the Akashic Records idea.
So even with accurate results, you could argue it's just really, really good psychic functioning, not proof of survival.
That's the counter-argument, yeah. It pushes the boundaries of what psi might be capable of, but it avoids the need for consciousness to survive death.
How does Kean navigate that?
She acknowledges super psi as a theoretical possibility, but she suggests that in the most compelling cases, the quality of the communication, the personality, the shared intimate memories, the feeling of presence she experienced points more strongly towards actual survival.
It's not just facts, it's the person coming through.
That's how she seems to interpret the best evidence, yeah. And the fact that research like Beischel's shows statistically significant results under blinding, well, it means something unusual is happening that needs explaining.
Either survival or psi abilities far beyond what we currently understand.
Pretty much. It's a complex puzzle.
Definitely. Okay, let's move to the final and maybe weirdest section. Part 4, the impossible made real. Physical phenomena.
Yeah, this is where things get, well, really strange. And definitely the most controversial area Kean covers. We're talking apparitions, psychokinesis, materializations.
Stuff that seems to flat out break the laws of physics as we know them.
Right. Understandably, skepticism is sky high here. Kean draws on historical accounts, but also, again, her own direct experiences, mostly in seances.
So what kind of phenomena are we talking about? Apparitions like ghosts?
Seeing figures, yeah. And psychokinesis PK objects moving without apparent cause. That could be poltergeist-type stuff or things happening in a seance room.
Levitating tables, objects flying around.
That kind of thing. But she focuses a lot on physical mediumship and materializations, especially her experiences with a British medium, Stuart Alexander.
Usually in low light conditions, right? Which adds to the skepticism.
It does. But she describes seeing objects lift and move independently, hearing independent voices, sometimes through those seance trumpets.
Which are supposed to amplify faint sounds.
Or act as focal points, yeah. allegedly using something called ectoplasm to form a temporary voice box.
Ectoplasm. That's a loaded term from spiritualism's history, often associated with fraud. What does Kean say about it?
She describes it as this sort of semi-physical substance historically linked to physical mediumship, supposedly allowing spirits to interact physically. She acknowledges the historical fraud, but seems to believe in the possibility of genuine ectoplasm in certain contexts.
Okay. What else does she report seeing?
Apports and asports objects appearing or disappearing seemingly out of nowhere in a closed room, even matter passing through matter.
Like objects passing through a table.
Allegedly. But the most striking things she describes are the materializations.
What form did those take?
She talks about partial materializations specifically, seeing and touching what felt like solid, warm, lifelike human hands. Distinct features, she says.
Touching materialized hands.
That's what she reports. And she mentions rarer accounts, historically and possibly witnessed, of full-form materializations, temporary figures that look human.
Wow. Okay. Does she connect this to historical accounts?
Yeah, she mentions famous mediums like Dee Dee Home, known for levitation and hands appearing, and the experiments with Frennik Kluski.
The paraffin wax molds.
Right. The idea was materialized hands would dip into wax, leaving behind molds that couldn't easily be faked, supposedly providing physical proof.
But again, the history of physical mediumship is rife with fraud, exposés, trickery.
Absolutely. Kean acknowledges this history head-on. She knows how extraordinary, how unbelievable these claims sound.
But she believes what she saw with Stuart Alexander was real.
She seems utterly convinced. She emphasizes the conditions, the consistency over years, and particularly that tactile sensation touching the hand felt undeniably real to her.
It sounds like this was the peak of her personal investigation, moving beyond interpreting data to directly witnessing the impossible.
That's how she presents it. And she even links some odd physical events in her own life, objects moving, to her deceased brother potentially influencing things.
So the argument here is that if these physical events are real,
they offer the most direct, tangible evidence for survival and interaction, less ambiguous perhaps than interpreting mental messages. But the evidence needs to be rock solid because the claim is so extreme.
Definitely the highest bar for evidence. So after covering all this ground reincarnation, NEEs, mediums, physical stuff, what's Kean's final takeaway?
Well, she doesn't claim absolute proof. Nobody has that. But she argues that when you look at all these different strands of evidence together—
the cumulative case.
Yeah, the cumulative weight of it, all the patterns in reincarnation cases, the verified perceptions in NDEs, the statistically significant results in mediumship studies under blind conditions, and her own experiences with physical phenomena, it strongly suggests that consciousness surviving death is a real possibility.
And that the purely materialistic view, consciousness is only brain activity, is probably incomplete.
That's the implication, that it can't comfortably account for the full range of these reported human experiences. Again, she stresses no single piece is definitive, lots of questions remain.
But she sees value in gathering it all, making the research like Beischel's more widely known.
Right, synthesizing it into a narrative people can engage with. But we have to remember the challenges, too.
Like the reliance on anecdotes sometimes, the super psi problem.
Exactly. And Kean's own personal experiences, while powerful for her, inevitably bring in that element of subjective interpretation, potential bias. It's hard to avoid.
So surviving death isn't presenting proof, but more like building a case.
I think that's a good way to put it. It compiles the intriguing evidence, highlights the research, and basically argues that the possibility of survival deserves serious consideration, questioning the limits of current science.
It definitely presents a challenge to just dismissing it all out of hand.
It invites you to look at the evidence and grapple with what it might mean.
Well, that wraps up our deep dive into Leslie Kean's Surviving Death. We've touched on past lives, near death, mediums, even materialized hands. Quite a journey.
It really covers the spectrum.
So for everyone listening, considering all these different types of evidence, what part, if any, really stands out to you? What makes you pause and think?
Yeah, what resonates most? And what other questions does it bring up for you about consciousness, reality, and, well, the big mystery itself?
Plenty to ponder there. We encourage you to keep exploring. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.